to Warframe. Warframe is a game that you hear about fairly often, especially within looter-shooter circles. You'll hear about how it's a pretty good game, surprisingly good especially, considering the slop that we get nowadays. It also has a very rich sci-fi universe, but it also has one of the most confusing ones, admittedly. But don't worry, that's not just you, and today we will talk about the setting without spending 5 hours on the Warframe wiki. Let's begin with where all of this takes place in, the origin system.
To wake you.
Thousands of years into humanity's future, mankind had spread and claimed the entire solar system. Earth, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and so on. At the center of this golden age, however, stood an empire known as the Orokin. Long before the current events of the game, the origin system was controlled by an unbelievably advanced civilization. So advanced that their technology and science may as well have been magic. They could reshape genetics, create artificial life, transfer their minds into brand new bodies, and so much more. The Orokin Empire's capital was on Earth's moon, Lua. The aristocratic ruling class of this civilization was dominant for an extended period over the system, perhaps for centuries or maybe even a goddamn millennia. They were ruled by 7 emperors and they had 7 executors, who actively enacted the will of the emperors. Now, the executors were the judicial body of the Orokin Empire. They were known for their mastery over biotechnology and gene manipulation, to the degree that they created a caste of clone workers, the Grineer, that were genetically programmed to obey their Orokin masters. They were also known for their skills in merging organic material with the inorganic, as seen with the living Orokin towers like the Unum, or the Infestation. Yeah, the Grineer, the Infestation, and the Corpus, they all go back to the Orokin Empire. We'll talk about that a bit more. With the Orokin Empire's incredible power and incredible technological as well as scientific achievements and capabilities, you may assume that this truly was a golden age. Unfortunately, the Orokin were assholes. The benefits of the Orokin's advancements were unfortunately not shared equally amongst all members of their society. They possessed a rigid hierarchy, which allowed for only a few lucky individuals to live fairly comfortably, be it as a scholar, an enforcer, or a servant, for the Orokin elite. Though these servants were still subjected to the whims of their oftentimes cruel masters, the rest of the population had it even worse. They were exploited for labor and used as disposable soldiers, as well as subjects for experimentation, willingly or not. There were families of farmers who toiled for the Orokin masters for generations, the Orokin exploiting their harsh manual labor to build their empire and fuel their whims, giving little compensation for their honest work in return. Orokin culture was centered around aesthetics, elegance, and beauty. Amongst the Orokin ruling class, there was also a focus on youth and extravagance. At some point, the Empire began to look to populate other star systems as well, particularly Tau. Presumably, this was done to quell their problems with overpopulation, overconsumption of resources, and pollution of the natural world. You, Orokin, so perfect on the outside, but you're rotted through and through. But when it came to colonizing Tau, they needed something different, which brings us to the birth of the sentience. The Orokin had long since realized that they were harming the origin system and still required a solution for, quote-unquote, the plan of colonizing the Tau system. A reliable means of traveling to Tau needed to be developed, as would Tau need to be terraformed for habitation. It was proposed by Archimedean, essentially a scientist, Perintol, that he could contribute to the plan. He proposed the creation of a race of synthetic beings, which later evolved into being known as the Sentients. to spearhead an expansion of Orokin influence beyond the Orokin system into the Tau system, by reaching the Tau system using the sentience and beginning their terraforming operations for their arrival. The Orokin sought to expand and prevent their empire's destruction. These original creations could adapt to any kind of damage and reproduce by fission while developing resistance to whatever had harmed them, making them the perfect tool to cross the perilous journey to Tau, building a solar rail along the way. They could also use any materials surrounding them to repair themselves. As a result, these sentient precursors would also be useful to enter the hostile terrain of the Tau and begin the terraforming process. However, there was a risk that these new life forms, with their adaptability and reproductive capabilities, could evolve into living, thinking machines and turn against the Orokin. Such ventures were forbidden under Orokin law. Archimedean Parentol said that there was an intentional flaw in their design: the void. A working principle of the solar rail that would connect the origin system to Tau was poisonous to them, and so they would not be a danger to the Orokin should something go wrong. At least that was the thought. The machines in Tau evolved and grew into sentience, gaining their namesake along the way to Tau, realizing that their Orokin creators would bring ruin to Tau eventually, the same way that they had brought ruin to the origin system. And as such, they rebelled. Exposure to the void, which they needed to travel through to return to the origin system, did not kill the sentience, but it merely rendered them sterile, unable to reproduce. The sentients under their leader Han Hao would start the rebellion. Thus, what would become known as the Old War began. Now, before we continue into the new war lore, let's quickly touch on the void and what it actually is. It is a strange parallel dimension that completely ignores the normal laws of physics. Time, reality, and even consciousness can begin to behave unpredictably while you're in there. All of a sudden, you may start hearing whispers. Delve deeper into this place. There might be something interesting. Take this relic. I'm sure it's not cursed or anything. Watch furry porn. I already do that, Void. The first major expedition was a disaster. The Zaraman colony ship got trapped inside of the void, and by the time it finally returned, every adult aboard was dead. Only the children survived. However, these children had incredible void powers now. And although nobody could fully understand how the hell that even works, it was beneficial. As the old war dragged on, what the Orokin had on their hands just wasn't enough. The sentients were able to adapt to the energy weaponry that they used. They were able to tank so much damage as well. They were able to repair themselves with whatever was around them. Simply put, their creations were too powerful. So the Orokin got desperate, and eventually this led them to create the Warframes. Faced with losing a war and getting their shit kicked in, the Orokin began to understand that what they had simply didn't get the job done. They needed something new, something that could match a sentient, especially in terms of combat. At first, they created the Necromechs, and for a time they were doing okay, but even the Necromechs had some limitations. In their desperation, the Orokin were forced to unearth their forbidden knowledge of the infestation that once destroyed their colonies in the past due to uncontrolled outbreaks. And at some point, Ballas, this dickhead over here, began researching new uses for the infestation by experimenting on both unwilling and willing subjects, drawn from the Orokin warriors, known as the Dax, and other castes as well. This research led to the creation of Warframes. Through a specialized strain of the infestation called the Helminth, human subjects were mutated. While the new Warframes were quite powerful, and initially they did very well against the sentients, they retained some remnants of their former consciousness from back when they were still human. The echoes of their lost selves manifested as intense rage and despair, making them very unpredictable and just as likely to turn against their own creators. Through events involving experiments on a Warframe similar to Rhino, the Orokin came to the conclusion that the Warframes alone were as uncontrollable as the sentients were, but realized that through transference, another mind could take control of a Warframe, a process that would later be developed into a technology by Margulis. Margulis's research eventually led her to work with an Archimedean specializing in infestation manipulation named Sylvana. Together they intended to develop a substitute body for the Tenno and allow them to move freely and interact with the world as a part of the transference therapy, as only the Zariman children were capable of carrying out transference safely, being able to empathize with the Warframe's traumatic experiences. They were intended by the Orokin to become the new operators of the Warframes. The Zariman children were trained into the fighting force known as the Tenno, what you start as the player. Through transference, they wielded Warframes to wage war against the sentients, proving to be highly effective, abiding by combat disciplines taught by the newly founded Tenno focus schools. Tenno-operated Warframes were equipped with melee and ballistic weapons to circumvent the sentient interference of high-tech weaponry. With the help of the Tenno, the Orokin managed to turn the tide of war over several lifetimes, leaving the sentients helpless against a combination of archaic combat techniques that they simply weren't able to adapt to, and void powers employed by the Tenno. That is, until Ballas defected. The Orokin faced another disaster. One of their own had betrayed them, that dickhead being Ballas. You're going to figure out why I hate him so much, and pretty much everybody else hates him so much in a little bit. Now, Ballas was one of the architects behind the Warframe project, and had fallen in love with a sentient named Nata. His hatred of Orokin society, combined with his feelings for her, led him to commit one of the greatest acts of treason in the Empire's history. Ballas secretly provided the sentients with Orokin knowledge, technology, as well as military secrets. Information that should have never left the Empire now rested in the enemy's hands, making the sentients an even greater threat. His betrayal wasn't motivated by a desire to save humanity though, nor was it to bring peace. It was deeply personal, driven by resentment, revenge, and his own ambitions. Ironically, Ballas would later betray the sentients as well. Throughout Warframe's story, Ballas repeatedly changes sides whenever it happens to serve his own interests. He is not loyal to the Orokin, or anyone else for that matter. He is loyal to himself and himself alone. And in the end, although the Tenno were able to defeat the sentients, victory came at a price. The Tenno realized that the Orokin were no better than the enemies that they had just faced. In some aspects, they were even worse. During a grand celebration, they turned against the Empire and assassinated much of the Orokin leadership. And overnight, the most powerful civilization in human history collapsed. Centuries passed without the Orokin to keep order. The solar system fell apart. With the Orokin Empire in ruins, the Tenno had fulfilled the purpose they had been created for. But instead of becoming the solar system's new rulers, they simply vanished. Following the collapse of the Orokin, the Tenno returned to a hidden sanctuary on the moon, again known as Lua. There, guided by the Lotus, they were placed into deep cryo-sleep. Lua itself was hidden within the void, making it almost impossible for anybody to find or reach. And so for centuries the Tenno remained asleep, while the origin system changed around them. The Grineer built a military empire. The Corpus amassed immense wealth and technological power, turning from a minor small faction to a genuine major faction. The infestation continues to spread to this very day. By the time the game begins, the legendary warriors of the old war had faded into myth. Many believed that the Tenno simply went extinct. Some began to question if they ever existed at all. But everything changed when the Lotus awakened a single Tenno, which is you. From that moment on, the Tenno are no longer fighting to save an empire, but they're fighting to protect a broken origin system from tearing itself apart once again. And that's going to be about it for today. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again later some other time. Have a great time. Goodbye.